Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the American Juche Study Group. My name is Noah Shank, and I am the founder of it. I'm a Korean American and an anti-imperialist activist with the Center for Political Innovation. I'm also the editor of this text. It is Juche for American Workers, Volume 1, which compiles the writings of both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-Il, and will be the text used for these weekly study sessions. So the American Juche Study Group is a broad initiative including people of all races, religious backgrounds, and political affiliations who are interested in learning the ideology of the Korean Revolution. We bring with us a spirit of intellectual charity and goodwill toward all humankind. We refuse to accept the hateful caricature of North Korea presented in American media, and instead wanted to learn the ideas that have held the DPRK together for so long and able to withstand circumstances that will most certainly cause any other government on earth to fall. We come with open minds and diversity of thought and share one goal: peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula in the context of a world without war and poverty, in which every nation is enabled to grow and thrive to its fullest potential. So we ask that if you're studying with us today, if you could just send a small contribution of $5 to support our work, because unfortunately, things cost things, and funds are required so that we can continue to do all that we do to support the DPRK and anti-imperialism in this country. We need an anti-imperialist movement in this country so desperately, and $5 would just be a small but very significant thing that you could do to help us. I'd also like to remind people that these are live study sessions, and they're open to the public. So if you're in the chat and you so feel inclined to contribute anything, you're more than welcome to follow the link and follow along with us and contribute if you have anything to say. So without further ado, I think we can get into the text. I think this week actually is not. The essay is not, we are discussing is not by Kim Il-sung or by Kim Jong-Il. It's actually by none other than founder of the Center for Political Innovation, Caleb Maupin. So the text for this week is Let's Talk About Korea, which was an article published in 2016, and it was republished. It was initially published in a Russian theoretical magazine, but was republished in Rodon Simon, which is the daily newspaper of the DPRK. I thought that we could open by just sort of having Caleb talk about, what inspired him to write it and, the atmosphere around writing it at the time. I think that would help with context,
Wow. Well, I had no idea we were discussing my article today. Wow. Okay. I figured we were just continuing with Juche ideology stuff. So this is taking me by surprise. I do have an image of it from the North Korean newspaper I can put on. If you'll give me a minute here, I can pull it up. I was totally taken by surprise that it showed up in the newspaper, and I was informed on Facebook by other people who support North Korea. Yeah, here's the newspaper page that it was on. Yeah, this is the newspaper page, and they basically they ran a bunch of it's like a bunch of different paragraphs from the article, and the headline was like American journalist defends North Korea or something like that. And it was just in their daily newspaper, and it was from the Russian Academy of Social Sciences, which is they have a magazine, a web magazine that I was writing for at that time called New Eastern Outlook. And I wrote the article, and I guess because of Russia's connections to North Korea and because it was circulated in Russian, they got it and they decided to republish it. And so, yeah, I was a little bit surprised, and pleasantly surprised and honored to see that they republished it. And I wrote it. I had just started as a full-time RT correspondent at that time. And I had a lot of time in the office, just chilling. So I would write these little articles for New Eastern Outlook magazine. And then on Facebook, I got a bunch of messages from people telling me and sending me, these images that it had been printed in North Korea's daily newspaper. So that was kind of an exciting breakthrough. I hope someday I'm able to get a print copy of it. I can go to Pyongyang and go to the archives of Rodong Singman and get a print edition of my article. So there we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's a very good article. It covers a lot of the common arguments, and common things that you hear about the DPRK in America. So, and it must have been really, really an honor to be featured in the daily magazine of the DPRK. But
Yeah, well, I will say that you know, at the time I had been a member of the Workers' World Party, which has a close relationship with North Korea, and I was no longer with them, and you know, but I continued to, you know, take with me what I'd learned about North Korea. I actually was able to visit the UN mission of North Korea with Deirdre Griswold, who was one of their founding members, a few times, and go to like a reception. And that was before I wrote this, back when I was in the Workers' World Party. And one thing I do remember was I was at the reception, and it was a lot of Korean Americans that support them and such, and also different UN missions were there, you know, like China and Russia. But and in the line to get in, behind me there was this guy with a huge beard, this like man with a huge beard, white dude. And I remember I asked him, I said, you know, what organization are you with? Why are you here? And he said, I'm from the Mennonite Church, and the Mennonite Church does, you know, we have missionary work in North Korea. And I said, oh, wow, that's great. And then this missionary, more Mennonite guy told me North Korea is so misunderstood. It's nothing like what we're told on TV. They're not going to try and blow us up with nuclear weapons. And he actually gave me a really pro North Korean line from this Mennonite guy from Pennsylvania who was in line with me. I thought that was kind of a neat story. So there you go. He had one of those like Amish beards where they don't have a mustache, but they have a beard, right? Kind of like Orthodox Jews and stuff like that. And he gave me a really pro North Korean line. And I guess at that point, the Mennonites did have a lot of people in North Korea, which I thought was really neat. So I learned that.
yeah, it is neat. I will say, Mennonites not so much, but like the Amish, that is such a uniquely American thing. I don't think it could really exist in any other country. You know, people, I mean, it would be considered like child abuse almost to just like for a lot, you know, to like keep people away from technology and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's a really beautiful thing about America that we could, you know, we can allow that as well, and we can be tolerant of people's religious beliefs because we're such a religious country. But also, I think it's so cool that they have like Mennonite missions going to going to the DPRK. That's something I didn't know. I know that, you know, the DPRK does allow Christian missions, and they've made a huge effort to rebuild churches and stuff like that that were destroyed as a result of the Japanese occupation, and that were destroyed as a result of the U.S. bombing of the area. But yeah, that's something you wouldn't hear because, I mean, according to what the internet says, I mean, communism is just this evil ideology that they just really hate Christians, and all they do is get rid of churches. So, there you go.
I just want to make a correction. The United States is not that free. The Amish right now are being persecuted in New York State. They're not allowed to attend their own schools because of the vaccination question. There's no religious exemptions in New York State, and in Pennsylvania, they're going after the Amish for just trading and bartering milk for eggs because, you know, can't have raw milk. And the Amish are not allowed to sell raw milk either. I mean, so I mean, yeah, the Amish are not really so. And then Waco's a perfect example of, yeah, we don't really allow religious
Yeah, it's kind of,
freedom.
we have freedom of religion until we don't, right? It's
Yeah,
totally inconsistent.
yeah.
Well, I do remember when I was in Ohio, one of the biggest news stories was that there was an Amish group that was fighting with the other Amish group. And so the one Amish group went to the house of the Amish group they were fighting and tied all the guys down and shaved off their beards. And they were prosecuted for a religious hate crime. And it was a really big deal in Ohio, the news of the Amish cutting each other's beards off. So there you go.
Only in Ohio, you know, only in Ohio. As the
You know,
kids say.
it's interesting because the Amish today, they'll have a beard but no mustache.
Right.
But if you look at the portrait of the founder, Jacob Amman, he had both a beard and a mustache. So I don't know where that tradition comes from.
Well, so a lot of Muslims have a beard and no mustache, and a lot of Orthodox Jews have beards and no mustache. And apparently, it all comes from something in Leviticus about like you should not shave below your lip or something. Like you're allowed to shave a mustache, but not a beard in like the Hasidic or the Leviticus law or something like that. It's like an Old Testament thing.
So it's a stylistic thing, I guess. Like you're allowed to, right?
Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah, and then for some reason, whaling ships, like the captains of like whaling ships, are always like that. They always have the beard and no mustache. So, you know.
Well, where I'm from, that's like that was like the huge industry here was whaling, right? You know, I think the property that my grandmother bought is like an old whaling captain's ship, and technically the National Seashore, the National Park Service bought the property from them, but because it belonged to a sea captain or something, it's considered historical, so they couldn't tear the house down. Like technically half of their property is owned by the US government, but they just can't get rid of the house because but there you go.
Well, speaking of ships and Juche, apparently Kim Il-sung, one of his first childhood memories was there was an American ship like coming near where his family lived, and they like threw rocks at it or something. Have you ever heard of this? Like it was like when Japan was just starting to occupy Korea, there was like an American ship, and like some of him and his family members all like threw rocks at it or something.
Okay.
Forgive my ignorance. Why did they do that?
Because I guess the USA was seen as collaborating with Japan's occupation of Korea. Yeah, the USA kind of like gave Japan permission to annex Korea, and so they were like protesting the United States. So
yeah, like the US and Japan sort of like made a deal about how they were going to divide up the Southeast Pacific, basically. Like the US would get to keep the Philippines, and then Japan would keep certain territories and stuff like that. And yeah, Japan, when it was emerging as a colonial power, right, it like had to get permission from the Western powers to do stuff, and it like wasn't really clear what the borders of what they would be allowed to keep was. Right. And that's why you had like the Russo-Japanese War, and you had, fights with the British over territorial possessions in Manchuria and stuff like that. And also disagreements with the United States about what they would keep as well. And ultimately, the decision was made at the end of the Second World War that they don't get to keep any of them, that they will be a colony of the United States.
Yeah. And the Russian-Japanese War, it's worth noting, Japan was bankrolled by Jacob Schiff, the leader of the the funder of the World Zionist Organization, to attack Russia, which is a little known historical fact. But Jacob Schiff hated the Russians because he considered them anti-Semitic, and so he funded, and he was given some big sword and all of this, and he bankrolled Japan to fight against Russia, which is a little known historical fact, which I think is quite interesting, that there was like a vendetta against Russia by Zionists.
Well, that is really interesting.
Quick correction. The Orthodox Jews cannot shave their mustaches. The Muslims do, but yeah. So was it Gavin who mentioned? Yeah. So the below your lip, that's only for Muslims. It's not for Orthodox Jews.
I've seen so many Orthodox Jews with no mustache.
Not supposed to. They're not supposed to have shears. No.
Maybe there's some sort of like loophole or something. Jewish people and their loopholes. Or really, I don't know. Well, Catholics too have their loopholes too. Anyway,
you got Gavin started there. Gavin perked up like he was going to say something about loophole.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, yeah, that's very true. Go ahead.
But yeah, let's go on to our first quote, because we got 9 to get through. So often when people are first becoming personally acquainted with me, and my political views, I will be asked point blank, do you support North Korea? I always respond, I don't support North Korea. I support all of Korea. Average Americans, and even many who consider themselves activists and leftists, there is a great deal of confusion about issues involving the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and its history. Each time there is an escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the level of confusion seems to get worse. The U.S. media makes no effort to educate the public about why Korea is divided, and often blatantly distorts and lies about it. I have similar experience too, as a Korean American, right? People who don't know anything about Korea, they find out that you're Korean, right? And they go, are you North or South Korean? And then you have to explain, well, actually, there's no ethnic difference between North and South Koreans. There's no difference. Like, Korea is one country, and there's an occupied Korea in the South, and then there's a free Korea in the North. Oh, do you support North Korea? It's like, well, I support the Korean people, and I think they have a right to self-determination. You know, and, you know, a lot of people think that, like, you know, the way it's taught in American schools, they act like the 48th parallel is like some sacred boundary, you know, that was like, you know, created on high, and that, like, there's this huge ethnic difference between North and South Koreans, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, historically, actually, Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, it was considered, you know, during like early feudal periods before Korea was fully unified, was part of the Northern Kingdoms. And actually, you know, the territory that we now know as South Korea, the border is so arbitrary. I mean, it was literally picked out by American military personnel on a National Geographic map. You know, the Soviets had been liberating territory, and there was a deadline. You know, after a certain point, you know, they would have, you know, there wouldn't have been they wouldn't have been able to set borders and stuff like that. And so they looked at a National Geographic map, and they said, oh, the 48th parallel of lateral longitude, you know, that's roughly halfway and allows us to keep Seoul, which is like the cultural, you know, historical, you know, capital. So that's where the border is going to be. And we're going to set up a military dictatorship there. You know, but people think that it's just, it's this magic border that, you know, have folks experienced that? I mean, the 48th parallel thing, you know, they think it's a magic border. I don't know. But yeah, I guess we can move on to the second. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I guess Jessica. I was just going to say they call it the demilitarized zone, and the name is like kind of contradictory because it's one of the most militarized zones in the world. But I guess it's demilitarized in the sense that it's like no man's land. It's neither one's property. So that's why they call it that. But it's like the name is like, you hear it, it's like, how is it demilitarized? It's like very, very, very militarized. So.
Right. And yeah, that too. And that, like, for whatever reason, I mean, of the socialist countries to defend, you know, North Korea is often the one you get the most flack for. You know, Cuba, okay, maybe, you know, people have been to Cuba. Okay. They understand that it's not so bad. Right. You know, even though it has the same political system as the DPRK. Venezuela, you know, you might hear some complaints about supposed meddling in elections or whatever, but I mean, those aren't true, but two, you know, generally people will be like, okay, well, I could see how a socialist would support that. But, you know, a lot of people think that the DPRK is a monarchy. You know, they think crazy things. You know, they think that, you know, Kim Jong-Un claims to have invented the cheeseburger, and I mean, just ridiculous things. I mean, you know, you can't just be like, do you really think that people believe that? Oh, are you defending North Korea? You know, you must be propagandized because everybody knows that, you know, he's a buffoon who claims to have played a perfect game of golf on the first try. You know, it's a bit ridiculous. I mean, and that's the extent to which the American people are propagandized and don't realize that they are, right? I mean, that's the classic joke, right? The Soviet and the American are talking to each other about propaganda. The American says to the Soviet, "Oh, you guys have such great propaganda in the Soviet Union. I really admire it." And the Soviet says, "Oh, well, it's nothing compared to American propaganda." The American says, "What propaganda?" Soviet says, "Exactly." Because we, you know, and we'll get into that later, the Hollywood movies, etc. But I think we can go on to our next quote, which is from the section, "Why is Korea divided?" And this talks about something that a lot of people do not talk about. A lot of people do not really acknowledge. I mean, you know, the horrors of Japanese occupation are pretty widely acknowledged by everybody but Japan. You know, Japan sort of likes to point to, we make good cartoons now. That seems to be, how they wanted to be remembered. If you bring up the stuff that they've committed, oh, well, I don't know, we make good cartoons. But they talk about persecution of Christians, and that's a common lie that goes around people who, I think they have dissident views about the Israel lobby and stuff like that, or maybe they have questions about the September 11th attacks, and they're opening to questioning things. But Candace Owens and others have said things like, "Oh, well, the Bolsheviks persecuted Christians and this and that." You never hear them talk about what the Japanese did to Christians in China and in Korea. And about the fact that, a huge part of the coalition that would become the Korean Workers' Party, which is the ruling party in North Korea, was the Christian party, because they had helped resist Japanese occupation. So when Korean pacifist Christians went out to protest against Japan in March of 1919, over 7,000 of them were killed. The Japanese military retaliated against nonviolent acts of civil disobedience by randomly setting schools on fire and causing hundreds of random Korean children who had nothing to do with the protests to die in the flames. Tens of thousands of Koreans were rounded up and tortured by the Japanese on the mere suspicion of being involved in the pacifist Japanese movement. After the failure of nonviolent struggles, Koreans took up arms against the Japanese occupiers. In the 1920s and 30s, Kim Il-sung and others received military and political training from the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party and the Korean Communist Party often closely cooperated in their activities. Armed Koreans and Chinese communists received a lot of guns and money from the Soviet Union as they fought for basic democratic rights against the Japanese occupiers. And if you'll recall in the essay about where Kim Il-sung is speaking to Billy Graham, he mentions this. He talks about the persecution of Christians that happened under Japanese occupation, because the Christians were seen as people who were opposing Japanese occupation, because the Japanese outlawed the Christian religion and forced the Korean people to practice Shinto and other Japanese pagan religions, which were considered to be foreign. That's something that he talks about. And Billy Graham's wife, who was actually born in North Korea, she fled North Korea before it was North Korea. She fled it when it was under Japanese occupation because of the oppression of Christians. And you'll see those are photos from the of the Japanese attacking the images from the peaceful movement against the Japanese occupation, which Kim Il-sung was originally a part of. Gavin, I think you have something to say on this, or?
I was just going to ask if there was a booklet ever published of the conversation between Kim Il-sung and Billy Graham, and I searched it and it doesn't look like there is.
No,
but maybe
there
somebody
is.
can correct me if I'm wrong.
There is, and that's what we took the text from on here. Yeah, it's called "Talk with a Christian Evangelist." That's where we got the text for the book. Yeah, we published the full text in the Juche book, but it's called "Talk with a Christian Evangelist." You can get a PDF of it from the what do you call it? From the Pyongyang Foreign Language Press or whatever. There's a PDF you can get. So, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, it's Talk with an American Evangelist. There's the full text of their conversation, and then also, if you go onto one of Billy Graham's websites, you can also hear audio of him talking about going to North Korea and sort of actually praising North Korea to some extent. So,
yeah, Billy Graham, as I said on one of these streams, actually said that the Soviet Union had religious freedom, and then the neocon Christians really tore into him for saying that. And typical of Billy Graham, he kind of backed down. So I don't know what his real opinion was, because he tried to be everyone's friend, and that was one of the problems with him. But that was maybe a good thing in this case.
Right. I think of even there are a lot of people who don't they'll take a slightly anti-imperialist position and they'll get canceled for it, and then they'll immediately apologize. I remember when John Cena, yeah, he was promoting Fast and Furious or one of those movies. He accidentally made a comment that implied that Taiwan was not a part of China, and that offended Chinese people. And so he replied in Chinese saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I've been educated. I now realize that Taiwan's a part of China." And, people were just so upset with him about that. And he ended up apologizing for it. And it's like, well, just acknowledging this basic fact that even the US government has acknowledged since the 70s that Taiwan is a part of China. You're not even allowed to do that,
Yeah,
And it's
he's not particularly pro-China, but compared to the average celebrity, he is, and he was really, really, he took a huge hit to his reputation for being correct.
yeah, just for being correct. And that, it's similar to it's similar actually to the border between North and South Korea. Well, everybody knows that it's always this thing that's existed. Taiwan's always been its own country. Everybody knows. And you'll point out, well, we actually don't know. Actually, we've acknowledged since Nixon, since Nixon, that it's a part of China. Oh, but everybody knows, and we're going to go to war to defend Taiwan. We're going to go to war to defend the U.S. occupation of South Korea, because everybody knows that the North Koreans just woke up one day and decided to invade South Korea for no reason. So that's what everybody knows. But I think we get into a little bit of the reality in our next quote. So when the Second World War ended in 1945, the northern half of the Korean Peninsula had been liberated by Soviet troops. The southern half of the Korean Peninsula soon became occupied by American troops. In the northern part of the country, major anti-Japanese resistance political parties, including communists, social democrats, agrarian revolutionaries, anarchists, etc., Christians, and many others, merged in 1948 to form the Korean Workers' Party. The understanding at the war's conclusion was that there would be a nationwide election in which every political party, including the very popular Korean Workers' Party, would be allowed to participate. However, in the southern half of the peninsula, a military dictatorship was established. Syngman Rhee seized power and violently repressed all opposition. The Rhee dictatorship was openly supported by the United States, and thousands of U.S. troops poured into the country to prop up the military regime. And something that's actually not talked about a lot is that when the North Koreans began to go into the South to defend the people, the incident that really sparked it was that the South Korean military dictatorship canceled the elections, and students on Jeju Island began to protest against it, began to protest for democratic rights, for the right to vote, for the right of communists to be included in the election. And the Rhee dictatorship just killed all of them, just massacred them. And the coalition government in the North felt so compelled to defend their countrymen and the rights of their countrymen that they had just fought, a bloody war to try and liberate, that they began moving southward. And the military dictatorship was so unpopular that as the North Koreans would enter a new territory, they just wouldn't fight. And you can find documents of American troops complaining basically that whenever the North Koreans would enter a new territory, that would be greeted by the local population as, liberators, and they were like, oh, these Koreans, they're just so lazy. They have no will to fight, basically. And it's like, well, they didn't seem so lazy when they were fighting against the Japanese. They were praised, but yeah, they don't want their country to be occupied. That's worth pointing out.
I would like to recommend, there's two very good books, or two I guess, writers. Anna Louise Strong, who I really, really like. She wrote this book, In North Korea, First Eyewitness Report. And this is before the Korean War. And it's about like the government in the northern half of the country that was formed. It's very, very, very good. I would recommend it. And it's very short. And she like interviews the prime minister, and she interviews Kim Il-sung, and she interviews like average people on the street. It's very, very good. And the full text of it is online at the Marxist Internet Archive. You can read the entire thing. So I would recommend In North Korea by Anna Louise Strong. I would also recommend, there's a writer, there's a writer named Wilfred Burchett, who is Australian, and he reported from North Korea before and during the Korean War. And he's very good as well. And I will put his bio page. Wilfred Burchett was his name. And he has a lot of good books that are available from Red Star Publishers. George Grunthal has republished them, actually, Red Star Publishers. Wilfred Burchett, some of his stuff. So there we go.
Yeah. And in the one, I was seeing one of the replays of one of the live streams we had, and my comments got kind of mangled just because of how it transmits sometimes. But in that one by Anna Louise Strong that you just showed, she interviews a Presbyterian pastor, and like a lot of Americans don't know that they have those kinds of roles, and he's a government minister as well. He's also like high up in the government. And I later found out that guy's church was destroyed by the USA. And so I always say that the USA brought atheism to North Korea because it ticks people off, but it's true.
Well, Anna Louise Strong is pretty notable in Washington state history because she was chased out of, I believe, Seattle politics. I think she was the first elected socialist in Washington state about 100 years before Kshama Sawant got chased out of her city council role.
Yeah, she was on the school board of the city of Seattle. Her claim to fame, she went to Oberlin College, and she started like an exhibit about child labor. And she went around the country with like a photo exhibit showing the horrors of child labor, trying to get child labor outlawed, and was an expert on advocating for the rights of children. And so then she was elected to the Seattle City School Board. And then she refused to, support military training and indoctrination for kids in the lead up to World War I. And so she was forced out of the Seattle School Board. And then she was a leader of the Seattle General Strike after World War I. In 1919, there was a general strike in Seattle led by the Wobblies. And she's also responsible for the first printing of a book by Lenin in English in America. Because a Soviet ship docked in Seattle, and they were able to translate a Lenin pamphlet that was on the ship into English. So pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
A quick point. I think the United States, speaking about the Jeju massacre, I think they massacred 20% of the population. It was something obscene.
Yeah, well, that would have been during the Korean War. Yeah, it was like 1 in 5 Koreans was killed. I'm not sure about the exact numbers about the Jeju massacre, but it was a lot of people. It was like thousands of people.
Yeah, Jeju Island. It was an island that was a stronghold of communists and leftists, and the U.S. government, the U.S. troops there just slaughtered people. There's a really good online film you can watch, Ghosts of Jeju, that actually interviews some of the American soldiers that were part of it and are like haunted by like images. Like there's one guy, like he says the ghost of one of the Korean children he kills, like visits him frequently. It's really eerie. You watch it,
Yeah, and the Wikipedia page claims if you look up the Jeju massacre, the Wikipedia page to this day, it still claims that all of the people killed there were communist guerrillas. That were killed, and they were fighting an insurgency against the South Korean government. I mean, this is like, it reminds me of like Israel just like murdering people indiscriminately, and then being like, oh well, they were combatants, they were enemy combatants. I mean,
yeah. Well, and even if that were true, the issue was that there was supposed to be a democratic election for the entire peninsula, and the USA canceled it and installed a military dictatorship. So by Western standards, rising up to demand the right to have an election after it's been canceled, is generally, I mean, that would be, it wouldn't be a bad thing for them to do. It just happened that election would have resulted in the communists winning. So I guess it needed to be canceled,
Mind you, according to even Western polling at the time, 70% of the population had a favorable view of socialism and wanted a socialist government for the Korean Peninsula. So that's worth pointing out as well. I mean, there's this idea that, communism is just this idea that, we install a dictatorship. Well, I mean, that's sort of what the United States government did, was install a dictatorship against the will of the people. And then, there's all this, this rabble, this crap about so-called democratic elections, and we care about democracy. And, right, the Russians are meddling in the elections, and the Chinese are meddling in the elections, and Venezuela are meddling in the elections, and they don't have fair elections in X, Y, or Z country. But I mean, the U.S. president even admits, Donald Trump even admits, we have the worst elections in the world, straight out of the mouth of the U.S. president, comparable to a third world country, and nobody can defend our elections here. So,
yeah, I mean, the president of the United States says we have the worst elections ever. So, yeah. I'll take it.
Yeah, we should invade ourselves. Right? Like the Civil War.
Invade ourselves because of our unfair elections. Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyway, we go on to our next quote.
Okay.
So this is talking about the issue of democracy in South Korea, or the lack thereof, because what we're told is that the reason that North Korea is not successful and South Korea has a pretty vibrant economy at this point, relatively competitive. I mean, it's not what it wasn't, before George Soros and others pulled the rug on the Asian tiger market countries. But it's relatively wealthy, especially, well, that's because, South Korea, they just believe in democracy and freedom there, and they have capitalism, and that North Korea with its state-run economy, oh, well, it's bad. Well, let's talk about democracy in South Korea. During the majority of the years between 1945 and today, the southern half of the Korean Peninsula was ruled by unapologetic military dictators, Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee. Syngman Rhee is like slightly more defendable, even though he was a worse leader, I would say, for Korea, because he was at least not a Japanese collaborator. Whereas Park Chung-hee was like he was a Japanese collaborator. That's what he was doing at the time of the Second World War. He was collaborating with Japanese imperialists. It's sort of similar to how in Germany, the leaders that we installed there were all former Nazis. It's a similar thing. He was a Japanese collaborator, but he eventually did want to move Korea in a different direction, and they killed him for it. Had no pretense of being democratic. They were violent, repressive military autocrats who were fully supported by the United States. Tens of thousands of American troops have been in South Korea since the end of the Second World War, and often the U.S. troops were used to violently suppress democratic uprisings against Rhee and Park dictatorships. After a series of student uprisings, labor protests, and other upsurges among the population, in the 1980s, Korea transitions towards a less repressive government. However, even today, the government in South Korea is hardly a poster child for human rights. The Unified Progressive Party, the only genuine opposition party in Southern Korea, was forcibly broken up by the government in 2013, and 5 candidates from the Unified Progressive Party, who had won seats in the government, were not permitted to take office. The leader of the party, Lee Seok-ki, was sent to prison for 12 years, and her conviction was based on a tape-recorded hypothetical conversation about what would happen in the event that the United States went to war with the DPRK. It's ridiculous. I mean, they have the case of he mentions the case of Park Jong-Il, who was sent to prison for almost a year for tweeting statements that vaguely hinted that they might support the DPRK.
No, it was worse than that. It was worse than that, actually. He was retweeting Kim Jong-il's tweets, ironically, and he was spreading North Korean propaganda. That's what it was. It wasn't even political, and he was like a comedian. He was just like trying to be edgy or something, and he retweeted Kim Jong-il, and that was what got him a prison sentence.
It's wow, that's worse than I thought. I mean, yeah. I mean, and there's this idea that South Korea is just this free country and they're so great because they have freedom or whatever. I mean, it's just nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, and the idea that the South Koreans have political autonomy in any sense of the word. I mean, when Park Chung-hee, started to move Korea in a slightly more independent direction, he revitalized their economy because North Korea was making them look bad. Created Samsung, created Hyundai, created the modern Korean economy, and then said, hey, well, maybe we could move towards getting a nuclear weapon, and then we wouldn't have to have U.S. troops occupying the Korean Peninsula. The head of the Korean CIA met with him at dinner and shot him in the face.
Yeah, I'm going to put in the chat what Amnesty International, which is certainly not an anti-imperialist source, what they've said about the national security law in South Korea. It's one of the most absurd, undemocratic laws in the world. It basically says if you say anything that would be conceived of sympathizing with North Korea, we can throw you in jail. And it's up to us to determine what it is. And you can read what Amnesty International, I can find what Human Rights Watch has said about it. The idea that South Korea is free, I mean, right now they're not as tight as they have been in the past, but the idea that they're free, they have freedom of speech or freedom of assembly and all that, they absolutely do not. There's a reason there's no official communist party. in South Korea, even though there are many people in South Korea that do support North Korea, and that's very clear. I mean, it's not legal. If you were to say we're the Communist Party, you would immediately go to prison.
Well, even basic social democratic parties have been banned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think of even our friends in the Unification Church. I mean, they are by no means a communist organization. I don't think anybody would argue that the followers of Reverend Sun Young Moon are communist sympathizers.
Not at all.
Right.
Yeah.
But because of their religious beliefs, sort of say, well, they don't believe in war. They believe in peaceful solutions, and they want to, they want to have business and relations with the people of the DPRK, and they want to have a peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Because of that, was perceived as being too pro North Korean, and they threw Hak Ja-han Moon in prison. And it's an 80 something year old woman, and they're moving towards making that church illegal. And the national security laws. I mean, people point to testimony from so-called North Korean defectors. Oftentimes, they point to that as an example of, that proves that North Korea has all these violations, and they believe all these crazy things about their, about the South and about the world, and they're so isolated and this and that. And it's like, well, if you flee a country, probably most cases for economic circumstances, let's say even hypothetically, a lot of these defectors don't have a negative view of their government. Maybe they're just poor and they're looking for opportunity, right? And they know that if they go to the South is a wealthier country. And, they don't really have an education that is considered legitimate in those eyes. And the only way that they can make money, is by lying about the DPRK. On the one hand, that testimony is being made under duress because of the desperate circumstances. A lot of North Korean defectors live in poverty and are basically relying on essentially clickbaiting through tabloids and TV programs that are meant to demonize the DPRK. On the one hand, that's true. And on the other hand, even if they were to say anything truthful about the DPRK and about how it's an ordinary country where people live ordinary lives, they could go to prison. So there's two levels on which those testimonies are made under duress. And I should remind people, people make claims about, in DPRK, they believe, all of these crazy things. In South Korea, they printed in textbooks as late as the 80s, as late as the 80s or 90s, that, this was something that every South Korean child was taught in school, that people in North Korea have horns and tails.
And live in caves.
They literally have horns and tails.
And they live in caves. Yeah, they live in caves in North Korea. They don't have houses.
And they have to drag trains.
Yeah. One thing that when I was at the UN, North Korea, was during the Obama administration, and the United Nations staged in New York City and in Japan and in South Korea 3 human rights hearings about North Korea that were propaganda. And there was a German communist newspaper that had a correspondent at the United Nations, and she continued to, raise and force the United Nations press to just dodge the question that it was illegal under the UN's rules to have a human rights hearing in South Korea because it's under duress, because of the national security law. None of the people that testified could say anything good about North Korea, or they would go to jail in South Korea. It is illegal. So everything in those human rights hearings that were done in South Korea should have been completely thrown out by the United Nations, and that it violated the UN's human rights principles to even stage them. If you can't have human rights hearings in a country where people are not free to say what they actually think without, retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, that's on the level of having somebody following somebody into a voting booth to check what they vote for and stuff Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I think we should move on to our next quote. We're a little short for time, but so this is going to talk about Korean conditions in the North and the South, and the fact that we've been lied to about that as well. So during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, even through the early 80s, the Democratic People's Republic in Korea, in the northern parts of the country, had a very strong economy. This fact will, of course, be dismissed as outrageous propaganda by most Americans, but the BBC confirms it, and now the Wall Street Journal confirms it as well. About today, the world's most surprising economic success story is North Korea, which talks about how the DPRK being able to have military contracts with the Russians and with the Chinese has really been a boon for their economy, how they've been able to produce technology in their country. And the BBC also admits that if you lived in Korea, really before like 76, like you wanted to live in North Korea. I mean, that's just a fact. Conditions in South Korea were in poverty. I remember, my mother was an orphan in South Korea, and she talks about how she lived in Seoul, and her she got lost, and the government basically told her that your parents don't want you anymore because they didn't want to bother looking for them, and that she slept on a mat and she ate nothing but rice in an orphanage. She did not have a bed. Circumstances were very desperate. She recalls being very, very desperately poor. And that's not something you would hear. I mean, they had concentration camps for homeless children in South Korea. I mean, these are not things that you would hear, about South Korea. We have this image of them that is like, K-pop and, how beautiful cities like Seoul are. And I mean, they are very beautiful, but historically, the level of development was behind until the United States essentially twisted the arm of Japan and forced them to lend money so that they wouldn't have a communist revolution. And then in the 90s, during the Arduous March and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, George Soros and others, essentially did a rug pull on the Asian tiger market countries because they were seen as too independent and their economies were seen as too strong.
Yeah, I've got a couple things I'd like to add. First of all, you mentioned the concentration camps for homeless children in South Korea. I've got a link. There's a whole Wikipedia page and everything. It's really, really horrendous. I mean, basically, they just took homeless kids off the street and worked them to death. I mean, it's really horrendous. They've been having a lot of apology and truth and reconciliation about what went on in the military dictatorship. The other thing is I know we're short for time, but I do want to show this clip. I actually had the honor of knowing or having met a number of times. I wouldn't call him like my best friend or something, but I did hang out with him a number of times, and I used to see him at a diner in Manhattan. And I think probably Jessica may have met him. Did you ever meet Andy Stapp, Jessica? You remember Andy Stapp? So Andy Stapp was a Vietnam veteran. I guess he had been a member of the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. And he had started the American Servicemen's Union, a union.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a union for American soldiers during the war. He got kicked out of the army for starting that union. And the American Servicemen's Union was a really big deal during the Vietnam War. And then after the Vietnam War, he moved to North Korea. And he lived in North Korea for 3 years. And every day he would do a broadcast over the DMZ urging U.S. troops to defect to North Korea. Andy was a pretty badass guy. And this is a recording of Andy Stapp speaking at an anti-Vietnam War conference in 1969 that I found online. But Andy Stapp was a really great person, and he had lived in North Korea for years. And he was a member of Workers' World Party, and I used to see him at the diner. And he was a really nice man. And he actually became a high school teacher after he came back to the United States. And at his funeral, a lot of high school students, he taught at a high school in New Jersey. And a lot of his high school students came back and talked about how inspiring he was and how they got involved in activism because of Andy. But this was Andy speaking at a conference in 1969 as the leader of the American Servicemen's Union. He talks about North Korea, actually.
Have you ever asked yourself why we have had increasing trouble with discipline in our armed forces? Listen closely to the chairman of the American Servicemen's Union, and you will understand.
Okay, I'm going to run down some stuff tonight about the GI revolts and rebellions that have been going on in the U.S. Army over the last year, the organizing drive that we're undertaking. But before I do that, I got something real important here. Korean people have asked the American Servicemen's Union to send their greetings to the revolutionary young people in America. And they sent us a letter, which I'm going to read. Dear Andy, our thinking is that the ASU and the People's Korea will combine efforts in chopping the head off U.S. imperialism. Will combine efforts in chopping the head off U.S. imperialism and tearing its limbs in concert with the revolutionary people the world over, in mutilating the U.S. ruling circles, fully supporting the ASU. You will readily agree with us in this respect, I believe. Yes, right on. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is the banner of freedom and independence of our people, and also a powerful weapon of building socialism and communism. Your contributions will greatly encourage the Korean people in their struggle to achieve an independent, peaceful unification of the fatherland, accomplishing the complete victory of socialism and communism. The ASU is playing a leading role in this fight, in this organizing drive. We have chapters of the American Servicemen's Union on 60 large military installations in the United States and 40 overseas. Just as the Bolshevik Party organized through the Soviets in 1917 against the Tsar and the oppression in Russia, the American Servicemen's Union is organizing Soviets within the U.S. imperialist army. The only line that's going to lead to victory, and revolution is a proletarian line in the army. And they know that whoever can command the allegiance of the rank and file troops, that command is going to be decisive in revolution or counter-revolution. And right now, the American Servicemen's Union is building an army within an army, a workers' militia inside the U.S. Army. And along with the Panthers and others, we're going to make that revolution. Power of the people.
Yeah.
Inspiring stuff. And speaking of the Black Panthers, I think our next quote talks about that. So, oh no, I'm sorry. This talks about the arduous march, but yeah, sorry. The DPRK's crisis of malnutrition during the 1990s was the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The agrarian parts of the Korean Peninsula are all in the south, while the north is very mountainous. Without oil from the Soviet Union, it became very hard for the DPRK's agricultural system to function. Sanctions from the United States made it nearly impossible for the DPRK to purchase things on the international markets, and as a result, there was mass starvation. The arduous march. It was a horrible. The 1990s. I mean, just a horrible time to be an anti-imperialist. I mean, Iraq was really suffering at that time. I mean, of course, Cuba. You hear stories about people getting by on sugar water. You know, just a horrible crisis of malnutrition that happened there. And then in the case of the DPRK, the U.S. imperialists saw it as an opportunity and really tried to make things worse. The DPRK was eventually able to try to negotiate some relief from some of the sanctions and the ability to get food from the United States through negotiations with Madeleine Albright and the Clinton administration, which were held up in Congress. They never really got any of the aid that they were promised. The idea was that the DPRK would not get a nuclear weapon, and that in exchange that they would get some food aid, which they never really received. And then, George Bush gives a speech after the September 11th attacks, after the invasion of Iraq, saying basically North Korea is next. And of course, under those circumstances, they felt the need to get a nuclear weapon. So don't ever let anybody tell you that the North Koreans they're just a bunch of crazy people who decided one day that they want to kill us all. And oh, that's another common thing. It's like, oh, they're always investing in military technology when their people are starving. Well, first of all, they worked really, really hard to achieve food independence. Unfortunately, they didn't anticipate the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there are a number of other problems concerned with them. And also malnutrition is not really an issue in the DPRK as of late. Their economy is actually doing much, much better. And they're having a huge housing boom right now. But yes, it is true that at one time they did have a crisis of malnutrition, and that yes, they're really interested in their security and sovereignty. It's almost like the most powerful military to ever exist has is occupying half of their country or something like that, and that they never really said. I mean, who would have thought that they would be interested in defending themselves and investing in their military? I don't know. It's a wild one. But speaking of the Panthers, we can go on to our next quote. I know we're a little strapped for time. Oh, sorry. No, I guess not. Defense spending remains a top.
Just very quickly, the famine was caused from weather warfare, which the United States was responsible for. I mean, that's a very important thing to bring up.
Yes, that too. Cloud seeding and other things. I mean, it used to be a conspiracy theory, the idea that the United States tries to do the internet, right? Chemtrails and stuff like that. But now it's been revealed. They've admitted to the extent to which, that they try and control precipitation and other things. So there's that. But thank you for that, Jessica. Yeah. Defense spending remains a top priority in the DPRK, and almost every Korean above the age of 18 is somehow involved in the military. Those who criticize the DPRK for this forget this is a country that is literally at war with the United States. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops are lined up along the borders. U.S. military routinely tens of thousands of U.S. troops, the U.S. military routinely rehearsed dropping atomic bombs on the DPRK, and the U.S. military general, Douglas MacArthur, publicly threatened to do this during the Korean War. Actually, this article is a little bit out of date because, recently, in spite of the fact that, the military does remain a huge part of the DPRK's economy, but they've repudiated the military first policy. The military first policy has been repudiated, and they've actually moved towards, they feel secure enough with their relationship with Russia and their relationship with China that they want to move towards a more trade-based economy. Another thing I think it is worth pointing out is that, you often hear, the DPRK is a sexist country, right? That these socialist countries, they're very misogynistic, right? I think at one point they published an article claiming that in the DPRK, women aren't allowed to ride bicycles. But this is something that's worth pointing out. Something that's worth pointing out is that in the DPRK, women actually, on average, tend to have higher salaries than men. They tend to make more money than men. And that's for a number of reasons. They tend to pursue higher education at higher rates. That's one thing. And on the other hand, men are much more likely, if they do get a formal education, to go into the military and to go into government, whereas women are much more likely to go into commerce and selling goods and go into business in the DPRK. And that's something that people don't really talk about, that actually in the DPRK, women on average do make more money than men. So it's like sort of a reverse wage gap kind of thing.
I've also heard that it's one of the few places in the world, the DPRK is, where women can walk around at night safely.
Yeah, that's something that's not really talked about either. Yeah, it's very, very, very safe. A very, very safe country. And I've heard similar things about Belarus as well. I've heard Belarus is very, very safe from people who've traveled there. I know Jessica has gone. I don't know if she could speak to that. But.
Yeah, very safe. Very, very safe. I had no issues being at night. I even asked women if there was a lot of feminicide, and no, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and it's worth contrasting. Unfortunately, I mean, the situation in the DPRK, where it's very, very, very safe for women, to the culture around South Korea and around Japan as well. Where they have to have separate train cars for women because they're so worried about sexual assaults. Where peeping toms and they're very, very unsafe, and part of that is the sort of bourgeois sexualized culture that's been imported there, and part of that too is the military occupation. Unfortunately, American troops do not really seem to respect the local population, and there's a lot of issues with crime, particularly around American military bases. But yeah, we can move on to our next quote. Because I know we're kind of at time, so I'm sorry. But the DPRK was very supportive of the U.S. Black Panther Party during the 1970s. The DPRK has come to the aid of the Palestinians. The DPRK also supported the people of Zimbabwe as they fought against the British Empire and an apartheid settler state called Rhodesia. The DPRK supported the people of Angola in fighting against the Portuguese colonialism. The DPRK even gave military support to Nelson Mandela and the African National Conference, while the U.S. described them as terrorists. And actually, when the leaders of the Black Liberation Army fled the United States, many of them ended up living in the DPRK. I know, I'm sorry, it's not Bobby Seale. That's not, what was the name of the New York leader?
Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver. That's him, and that's his image there. Yeah.
Yeah, Eldridge Cleaver. He lived in the DPRK for many years. I mean, in the 90s, during the Arduous March, he moved back to the United States and became a Republican, interestingly enough. And actually, as far as like Republican anti-communism, he's one of the smarter ones because he actually knows the ideology. So he's one of the more listenable ones. But the DPRK has gone out of their way to support not only the Black liberation struggle, the Palestinian struggle, the struggle of the Palestinians. I mean, Kim Il-sung adopted a Palestinian child. They helped the ambassador from Palestine named their kid after Kim Jong-Il because they had helped with fertility and stuff like that. I mean, the idea that the DPRK is a racist country, which is often propagated, that the DPRK is a supremacist country, a Korean I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, they just make shit up. It shows the extent to which they can just make shit up. And it's also worth pointing out, unfortunately, that a lot of what they are able to get away with they say about North Korea, it comes from racism. That there is a racist underlying message hinted at in the endless slander and mockery of Korea's leadership, is that the people of Asian descent are barbaric savages who naturally long for autocracy and need whites to forcibly civilize them and teach them about democracy, while the extreme demonization of the DPRK's leaders is the most blatant example. The old racist caricature of Asiatic despots and Mongoloid tyrants is gradually re-emerging in relation to Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia. And I think, the Ukrainian Nazis, I mean, they'll even say it like blatantly that, oh, well, like Russians aren't real Westerners. They're a bunch of like Asiatic Mongoloids, like Genghis Khan and stuff like that. And I mean, it's just very, very blatant, the anti-Asian racism. And I will say, as a Korean American, a lot of the anti-Asian racism is just considered to be okay. You know what I mean? It's, John McCain was a major presidential candidate, and he went around calling the Vietnamese people gooks. You could not do that for any other, could you imagine if you had a major presidential candidate who went around calling black people the N-word, or went around using racial slurs against Jewish people, or for that matter, who went around using homophobic slurs? I mean, the level to which it's just okay. It's okay to be racist towards people from anti-imperialist countries, of Asian descent in this country. It's ridiculous. I mean, and they have, they have the people, they do funny accents when they're mocking the leaders of the DPRK. I mean, SNL, they don't even bother to get an Asian person to do their Kim Jong-un. They have Fred Armiston, who's fucking Italian, squint his eyes and do buck teeth. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, the level of racism. I mean, they made that the interview movie with Seth Rogen. I mean, and Team America, World Police, and they just make all of these movies that make it seem like people in North Korea, they're just a bunch of kooks. They're a bunch of crazy, stupid Asiatic people who they can't understand civilized values. I mean, I don't know. It's just it's offensive, and if you're somebody who cares about stop Asian hate, that's a common liberal thing. Oh, stop Asian hate. Stop Asian hate almost seems to never apply to anti-imperialist countries, interestingly enough.
Yeah, and John McCain was not only totally prejudiced against Vietnamese people. I mean, Hanguk is a Korean word. That's not even correct, and so.
I mean, they can't even use the right slur.
And his life was saved. He was bombing North Vietnam and killing civilians, and his plane got shot down, and the villagers all wanted to kill him and lynch him because he was an enemy combatant. And it was a leader of the Communist Party in the village who figured out that his father was an admiral and said, don't kill him, and saved his life. And think about it. If somebody was bombing, flying planes over America and just bombing for some other country, and their plane crashed and a bunch of people got together and killed the guy, we wouldn't consider that to be a war crime. I think the Vietnamese saw it as a foreign soldier who was bombing them, and they were ready to just take revenge after his plane went down. And a communist woman saved his life, John McCain. So,
that speaks a lot to the forgiveness, that is present in these in the anti-imperialist world. And you read stories about the man who killed Che Guevara had his eyesight restored by Cuban doctors, and that's the spiritually good part of Marxism, the part that we try to preserve, the forgiveness and kindness towards your fellow man, and Marxist economics, right? That's what we really want to support, and not the uglier part that seems to be promoted. So there you go. Do we have any more quotes, or was that the last one?
That's the last one. Yeah. Do we want to put on your video and then we'll close out?
I think we can. Yeah. I apologize. We sort of ran a bit long, but
it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the video Noah did about CPI and our solidarity with North Korea. So we'll end with that. So thank you, everybody. Volume two is going to come out, right, Noah?
Yeah, I'm working on volume 2. Next week we'll have a text that will not be in volume 2. It'll be sort of an exclusive, but quite soon we will have volume 2 out. I have some of the texts coming. So there you go.
Very cool.
Recently, this article was published in the Wall Street Journal admitting to the tremendous economic growth that is happening right now on the Korean Peninsula, in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in North Korea, which has sparked a profound amount of new interest in the DPRK. And it's worth pointing out that no group has done more to promote the truth about the DPRK and to stand with them, to stand with the people of Korea in America than the Center for Political Innovation. Even before the Center for Political Innovation was founded, Caleb Maupin, our founder, was leading rallies in New York City to oppose the disgusting propaganda film Red Dawn while Occupy Wall Street was happening, waving the North Korean flag and storming into the AMC movie theater to make the point that Red Dawn was a disgusting propaganda film that made it seem as if the Koreans were a warlike people that wanted to attack the United States, when in reality, the Korean people have suffered like no other people under the boot of U.S. imperialism, have seen their country divided, and that the people of Korea do not want the United States occupying the southern half of the Korean peninsula. A year later, when Caleb went to Quito, Ecuador, for the World Festival of Youth and Students, he was able to meet with young people who were part of the Kim Il-sung youth. And he talks about how meeting young people from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, meeting professional revolutionaries, was a life-changing experience for him. And it started him on the journey that would lead him to founding something like the Center for Political Innovation, as he saw Americans who called themselves anti-imperialists refusing to do the work that is so important. In 2023, we at the Center for Political Innovation were outside the White House with a huge banner that read, "Finish what Trump started. Peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula." And later that year, we sponsored the New York City Peace March with Manhattan Family Church. We attended the World Youth Festival in Sochi, Russia in 2024. And when we did, we published a special book about peace on the Korean Peninsula and the opportunity for a peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, a journey of hope. And when we spoke at an official UN press conference beforehand, raising the Uhuru case, we also talked about our hopes for the Korean Peninsula. I, in fact, personally was involved in that.
Noah Shank, he will speak from there.
Hey, everybody. My name is Noah Shank, And one of the reasons that I am so excited to be able to join the World Youth Festival is that we will be able to meet with youth from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Right now, it is illegal to travel to the DPRK under U.S. law, and that's really unfortunate in light of the escalations on the Korean Peninsula. We have to remember that the DPRK is a nuclear-armed country, and these escalations, they could be very dangerous. That's why I think it's so important that, in combination with the fact that I, as a Korean American, feel a deep kinship with the Korean people, and I want to see them joined, that's why it's so important for us to meet with them. We've published a book to give to them, and we want to really show them that there are Americans in the United States who do not hate the North Koreans. Not only do we not hate them, but we respect them. We admire their revolutionary tradition. We admire how they showed support for the Palestinian people in their struggle for liberation. We admire how they welcomed the Black Panther Party into their country and showed support for Black liberation and for the liberation struggles around the world. It's just going to be a real honor to be able to meet with them.
Thank you very much.
During the World Youth Festival in Sochi, one of our members spoke on a panel with representatives from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, where they talked about the future of youth movements in the world and the role that youth can play in a world beyond US-backed globalism, imperialism. During the 2024 elections, we held our Peace MAGA campaign going outside of Madison Square Garden and going outside of Trump's inauguration, which was featured in a number of major media outlets as we stood there with 10-foot banners that read, "Only peace will make America great again." It had a banner of Trump and Kim Jong-Un shaking hands. And there was a touching moment where Koreans gathered around it as we handed out pamphlets about our vision for a world beyond US-backed globalism, imperialism. More recently, we have started distributing a pamphlet en masse which tells the story of Kim Il-sungya, a flower that grows exclusively in the DPRK and was originally a symbol of the friendship between the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and of Indonesia, and how we would love to see a day when Americans could have access to such a flower, when sanctions on the DPRK are lifted. We also do weekly Juche study groups and have recently published Juche for American Workers, which hopes to educate Americans about the ideology of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And as anti-imperialists, we also see within our own ideology of innovationism aspects of the Juche ideology, and we draw on the Juche ideology in many ways. Both of our ideologies have come out of the legacy of Marxism and of Marxism-Leninism and what communism and the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century meant to the people of the world. But we also go one step further. Although we acknowledge Marxism as a part of our heritage, we speak to the aspects of human beings as a creative species. Kim Il-sung said that human beings are unique and that we are social beings who embody the spirit of creativity. And we, as innovationists at the Center for Political Innovation, very much believe that as well. We also strive for a strong and independent country that can stand for its own, beyond the system of globalism, imperialism, and the bankers that have kept us poor. So if you are interested in solidarity with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, if maybe you've read this article at the Wall Street Journal, or you've read articles that admit the amazing economic gains that the people of Korea were able to achieve for themselves. For example, the BBC article, which mentions the economic miracle that happened on the Korean Peninsula. If you have come to understand the lies that have been told to us by US media about the people of Korea, then you may want to consider joining the Center for Political Innovation, because if there is an organization in the United States that is the DPRK solidarity organization, it is the Center for Political Innovation. Thanks for watching.
저부터 이 새날이 밝아온다.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone for watching. Have a good night.